African-American life was something else that intrigued Benton. His image of a minstrel show gives another view of how African-American life and the interchange between white Americans and African-Americans was played out in the 1930s and 40s. His most famous and best known mural is probably the one at the Missouri State Capitol in Jefferson City. It told not only the story of the history of Missouri, but in bringing it up to modern times, he included portraits of his friends so that it became very personal as well.
Like Jerome Fidelli's work in the Kansas State House only a few years earlier, Benton's murals in the Missouri State House became embroiled in controversy. Many legislators were concerned that the mural depicted their state in an unflattering light, and it was demanded that Benton's work be whitewashed out of existence. Cooler heads prevailed, and Benton's now classic work depicting Missouri life was preserved for generations to come. Benton's battle with the legislature was far from the artist's only clash with authority.
Teaching at the Art Institute was not entirely without its bumps. He got himself in hot water fairly quickly. As early as 1939, members of the Art Institute faculty and the community were trying to have Benton removed from his position.
Benton's independent attitude and often inflexible manner earned him enemies throughout the city's establishment. However, when the cries for his ouster grew loudest, students and alumni would rally in his support, effectively derailing the administration's efforts to remove him. However, that support could not protect him indefinitely.
It was finally in 1941 when he was asked to leave. Benton was an irascible character, and he had his own ideas about how he was going to teach. He had his own ideas about this community, and he was not one to remain silent about them.
Benton remained in Kansas City for the rest of his life, eventually befriending another plain-speaking Missourian, former President Harry S. Truman, and in fact, painting the mural at the Truman Library.
Mixed the contemporary with the historical, and in his concept of what contemporary art should be, that it both draws on the past but is grounded in the present.
He was gruff and but a really nice guy. I'm certainly glad that they made his home into a historical thing, because I think he's contributed more than any other painter in the history of Kansas City.
During the same years as the development of the Nelson Atkins and the Art Institute, another art form was growing in a far less affluent part of the city. There were no philanthropists endowing it, and no learned experts gathering it, but Kansas City jazz would, in the end, be no less world-renowned.
If you look at Kansas City's relationship to music, Kansas City has long been a destination in song. From Carrie's Gone to Kansas City by Blind Boon to Going to Kansas City in the 1950s, you have hundreds of references to Kansas City in song.
Well, I've been to Kansas City, girls and everything.
The principal influences on Kansas City jazz can be traced to really three influences: the blues, ragtime, and band music. The foundation really is the blues. According to Ma Rainey, she first heard the blues in Missouri in 1902. The blues comes out of rural traditions. It comes out of work songs or our hoolies, the call and response, with the singer calling and the band responding.
Kansas City was noted for the best blues stuff, you know. Musicians would come from further down south playing some stuff, but when they got to Kansas City, our stuff was a little bit more right, more on the blues kick.
What I think Kansas City jazz, when you blend the blues in, still got that basic rhythm. It's not the Arkansas, Chicago kind of wailing blues. It's a more an upbeat blues. The beat was more prominent.
And so the blues has always played a very important part in the musical fabric of Missouri and Kansas City.
The blues sound that had traveled upriver from the rural South was greeted by the then highly popular sound of ragtime, which had itself originated in rural Missouri.
Benny Moten led what was probably the most popular jazz band from Kansas City. He started out as a ragtime piano player. He wrote some rags.
The earliest ragtime composer in Missouri was Blind Boone. Now, Blind Boone was a concert pianist. He traveled all over the Midwest, and actually all over the world.
He was amazing because he was one of these people who had total recall. He could hear somebody play a piece of music and then go up to the piano and imitate it note for note. He would even include their mistakes that they made. He would feature ragtime in his classical performances. The way he would do it is he would say, we're going to take the cookies, put them on the lower shelf where everybody can get to them. And then he'd launch into one of his ragtime pieces.
His famous Strange contained one movement, which was Carrie's Gone to Kansas City. And the line is, Carrie's gone to Kansas City, I'm going to. So, the music reflects the migration patterns of Kansas City.
Like many other major towns, Kansas City experienced an influx of Southern blacks at the turn of the century, until 25% of the city's population was comprised of people of African American heritage. Their ragtime and blues traditions met the already well-established sounds of Kansas City brass bands.
You had one of the seminal figures in not only music education, but also in the brass band tradition and the choral tradition in Major N. Clark Smith.
Major N. Clark Smith was originally from Leavenworth. In 1916, he joined the faculty at Kansas City's Lincoln High, where he became a powerful influence on noted Kansas City jazz figures such as Walter Page and Harlan Leonard. Smith, who doubled as military instructor at the school, was known to be a strict disciplinarian, as one of his students, William Saunders, found out.
William Saunders one day forgot the three elements of music, and Major N. Clark Smith said, lay your head on the table. And Major N. Clark Smith took a ruler and reminded him by whacking him over the head with a ruler that music is harmony, melody, and rhythm. And William Saunders never forgot that lesson, nor did any of Major N. Clark Smith's students. Very, very significant figure in the development of Kansas City jazz.
The first recording of jazz music was in 1917. This revolutionary sound was spelled with two S's on those initial recordings. Legend has it that in that same year, two traveling groups met on 18th Street. They were heard to play the melody of a song straight, and then jazz it up, thus identifying Kansas City as one of the birthplaces of jazz. The distinctive Kansas City sound was marked by the walking bass line, pioneered by Blind Boone, and further developed by Walter Page, as well as a unified rhythm section, providing a solid foundation for instrumental soloists.
Another thing about Kansas City is the use of riffs, which is a melodic statement, which is stated in forceful rhythmic terms. And when you hear in Moten Swing, they're using a riff.
Benny Moten attended Lincoln High and studied music there, and with many of the area's ragtime performers. However, he made his real name in jazz, forming the first organized jazz band in Kansas City in 1918. Over his tragically brief career, Moten's band included some of the jazz era's greatest names, including William Macy, Jimmy Rushing, and Ben Webster, among others.
It was the Moten's band that really refined Kansas City jazz style by the emphasis on riffs, the unity of the rhythm section, and the great soloists.
One of the first bands to help establish Kansas City's national reputation was formed by Carlton Coon and Joe Sanders, and did so by tapping into the power of a new medium,
Coon Sanders' original Nighthawk Orchestra were the earliest Kansas City jazz bands to break out nationally. And they did so through their late-night broadcasts from WDAF. WDAF in those days was owned by the Kansas City Star. So when WDAF went online, it could be heard all across the country because there was no competition for the airwaves. It was the Nighthawk Frolic from the Plantation Grill and the Hotel Mule Bar. These broadcasts from the Midwest, of course, established Kansas City's reputation as a music center because young people all across the country would listen to these late-night broadcasts. They went on at 11:30 and broadcast, I think, until 1 o'clock.
Within the first 2 years, Coon Sanders had over 37,000 members in their Nighthawks Listening Club and were heard from Hawaii to Maine, Canada to South America. The band's success soon led them to New York and a spot on the fledgling CBS radio network.
Very popular band. They were widely popular and too often overlooked. Their contribution to the Kansas City jazz tradition.
The next Kansas City musician to receive wide recognition was Andy Kirk and his 12 Clouds of Joy. Kirk's band featured another Kansas City innovation.
Kansas City, there's a pretty girl named Mary Lou.
We had two of the great bands that came out of Kansas City. Andy Kirk and his 12 Clouds of Joy had Mary Lou Williams on piano. And the George E. Lee Orchestra had Julia Lee featured on pianos. This is really unheard of across the rest of the country. And the 12, 13-piece band with a woman at the keyboards.
Most women in jazz bands were singers, among them Kansas City's Myra Taylor, whose hit The Spider and the Fly launched a career that spanned over half a century, with performances on nearly every continent.
They were desperate for singers, at this time. All those combos wanted somebody to sing, And they took me on a job we didn't know but 4 songs. And we got fired after the first intermission because the piano man got drunk. It's a low down dirty life.
One of the reasons that Kansas City bands attracted such top-notch talent was that most of the U.S. was mired in the depths of the Great Depression. In Kansas City, though, political boss Tom Pendergast had created a thriving economy based largely around vices such as gambling, prostitution, and a complete rejection of prohibition.
You couldn't go to a chamber music concert and have a drink, so you had to go to one of the clubs. People were not going to the symphony to get a drink. They were coming to the AA club, which, as I understand it, was almost a bar, nothing fancy.
The intemperate environment of Kansas City really was responsible for the flowering of Kansas City jazz. Small clubs, dance halls. There were lots of employment opportunities for musicians that came to Kansas City.
Reports of the number of Kansas City clubs vary, but there is no doubt there were hundreds. The clubs ranged from fancy ballrooms such as the Playmore and El Torreon to the stylish Plantation Grill at the Mulebach and Martin's on the Plaza. Outdoor venues like Fairyland Park and on to the raunchy Dante's Inferno and dives like the King Kong Club, the Reno, and the Wiggle Inn. The State Line Tavern straddled the border between Kansas and Missouri and featured a white line painted down the middle, so customers could avoid police raids by stepping over the line and into a different state's jurisdiction. Many of the city's clubs were white-only establishments, but there were even more African-American clubs, as well as some that allowed both black and white patrons, often called black and tans.
Clubs that men didn't have no closing time or nothing like that. They just, from in the morning when they sweep, open the door, from then until the next morning.
The clubs were christened by the club owner, giving the cab driver $5 and a key to the club with instructions to drive as far as they could, throw away the key, because they never closed the doors. It was early Las Vegas. It's not by accident that individuals from Kansas City fostered Las Vegas. Basically, they did what was going on 12th Street.
Job opportunities led to a huge influx of musicians, which in turn led to a need to organize.
Around 1920 or so, and the state changes with who you talk to, they purchased this facility here on Highland and created the Negro Musicians Union. We were Local 627, one of the few chartered unions in the country. The members at that time were mostly bands. When we talk about jazz in Kansas City, that's what this building represents, the beginning of it.
Kansas City's scores of clubs did more than just provide employment for the city's musicians. They also provided a breeding ground to develop new sounds and new talent in a free-form gathering of musicians that at the time was virtually unique to Kansas City.
Anybody would come to a jam session. They would sit all over the room, you know, when they come in. Place was packed.
Well, the jam sessions belong to the musicians. What happens is that local musicians come here to play with one another after their sessions have ended, wherever their gigs are.
Legend would have it that the greatest jam session in jazz history happened in Kansas City at the Cherry Blossom Club. That night, Coleman Hawkins of the Fletcher Henderson Band was bested by the inimitable Lester Young.
When Lester vanquished Hawkins, it became a metaphor for the ascendancy of Kansas City jazz tradition. Cats in Kansas City had a reputation for having sharp claws.
Kansas City's jam sessions weren't just raucous musical gatherings that ran all night.
There's a tradition in Kansas City that came out of the breakfast dances in Harlem, and they were called spook breakfasts. And those evolved into Blue Monday parties. They were called spook breakfasts not out of any racial context, but because the late night hours that the musicians kept were the same as ghosts or spooks.
A lot of people didn't go to work on Mondays, but mostly you had musicians, entertainers, musicians, and people in the nightlife. Bellhops, you know, waiters and things. They were the ones that would pack the place because they could sleep late the next day.
Benny Moten's death in 1935 from a botched tonsillectomy proved to be a major turning point in the development of Kansas City jazz.
Moten's death led to the emergence of Bill Basie. Count Basie really was an apprentice in the Moten band. He learned how to be a band leader by watching Moten. But Moten's death is kind of a watershed incident. After Moten's death, Basie went his own way and formed a small ensemble at the Reno Club that, of course, was the nucleus of his big band later.
One of Basie's biggest boosters was a local writer with some national connections.
It was Dave Dexter Jr., who was a journalist that first wrote about Kansas City jazz. And he'd been contributing to Downbeat. And he used Downbeat to help break Kansas City bands, including Jay McShann and Harlan Leonard, as well as the Basie Band. It was Dexter who was really the champion of Kansas City jazz.
Count Basie eventually moved to New York, where he and his Kansas City swing style became one of the cornerstones of jazz. Another influential band leader was pianist Jay McShann. Out of the McShann Band also came one of the most influential figures in the history of jazz, Charlie Parker.
Jay McShann's band was a young band. The oldest member was 26. But the Jay McShann Band was a very modern band. Charlie Parker had already written Yardbird Suite as a member of the McShann Band, known in those days as What Christ Loved.
He didn't know the blues, but the stuff he was playing was tough stuff for saxophone, you know. In time to come, he finally got himself together.
He synthesized the elements of Kansas City jazz into what would be bebop, which really marks the beginning of what would be called modern the swing era. There's no doubt about it. Charlie Parker is a pure product of Kansas City jazz style, and he is the extension of that style.
Charlie Parker wasn't the only Kansas City musician who took jazz and moved it into the future. In the dark environs of the Sunset Crystal Club on 12th Street, a singing bartender who never learned to read and his pianist friend were on their way to making musical history.
Joe Turner first began performing in Kansas City in 1932 when he was just a boy.
He couldn't read. He wouldn't know his name if he read upside down.
The way that illiterate people memorize things is by patterns, which lends itself naturally to song lyrics. He had a particular gift for making lyrics up and remembering lyrics and doing variation on lyrics. One of them were quite risque. Before Joe, really no one was doing that kind of big open throat, shouting style of blues. He was really the pioneer of that. You know, Pete Johnson and Joe Turner were known for playing chorus after chorus of the same song. It was widely reported somebody walked by the Sunset Club and hear him doing, Rollin' Pete, and come back an hour later and they'd still be doing Rollin' Pete. It's the boogie woogie style which really evolved into rock and roll. Joe Turner is undoubtedly the father of rock and roll.
No golden moment in art history lasts forever, and Kansas City's days as a haven for jazz came to pass as well. Political and social reform movements eventually ousted Tom Pendergast, and he went to jail for tax evasion. The city's clubs began closing en masse, and musicians again found themselves out of work. However, another often ignored factor was responsible for the decline in work for jazz musicians.
When the jukeboxes came in, that's when the musicians had to start looking for jobs. Because the jukebox paid all of the expenses. When they take those nickels out, they paid just for the week. And so the people bought the jukeboxes. They didn't just rent them. They bought them. And that money went to them.
If the golden age of Kansas City jazz has passed, it has not been forgotten.
We're not California cool jazz. We're not New York's bebop. We're not Chicago's, driving rhythm jazz. We're Kansas City, and our jazz is unique because you can hear the blues and swing. It's a sound that you recognize anywhere.
Undaunted by 2 world wars and a depression, Kansas City approached the half-century mark with the same indomitable spirit and optimism that had been a hallmark of the city's history. And once again, the arts had led the way.
Art itself is a very important part of the creation of civilization. Art is an important piece of the fabric of our lives. Without it, we'd be very different.
I'd like searchlights in the night, gorgeous teeth and snowy white. Take a look, here comes my ball and chain. She's a sunny gem to me, tons of personality. Take a look, here comes my ball and chain. Oh, we do a hug when we hit its hair. How she can cuddle is no man's affair. I looked around from pole to pole, found her in a sugar bowl. Look out, here comes my ball and chain.
Kansas City has been made possible by a gift from Miller and Jeanette Nichols, who dedicate this series to Jan Kramer and Henry Moran for their continuing efforts on behalf of the arts in Kansas City. It is offered as a gift to our viewers in conjunction with KC 150, the Kansas City Sesquicentennial celebration. The producers wish to thank Paddock Productions for the high-definition television equipment used in making this series, and Joan Israelite and the Arts Council of Metropolitan Kansas City for their assistance.